Good afternoon to everyone, and I want to thank Jean-Pierre and also Raphael, my colleague, for the invitation to be here. It's with great pleasure that I'm going to bring you the point of view of economics, but mostly behavioral economics, which is my area of research on this very important and critical topic for us, for our children, and for the future of Switzerland and the world. So, as usual in my lectures, and I have some of my students here with me too, I always start by giving you the point of view of standard neoclassical economics on how can we change things for the better, how can we change policy to get more responsible consumption. So I will start by giving you the point of view of standard economics on the problem and what, according to neoclassical or standard economics, what should be done, what policies should be implemented to promote more responsible consumption. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because I think most of you in this room know what I'm going to be talking about. And then I jump immediately to behavioral economics and the different types of policies of behavioral economics. So, but to get things started on a very kind of solid basis, why do we need to interfere in markets? Well, we need to interfere in markets when markets are not functioning properly. Okay, so there's this standard of markets that can solve all the problems. And markets can solve many problems, and they're very efficient, but there's problems that markets cannot solve, and problems that are associated with the fact that a lot of our decisions, they take into account private costs and benefits, and sometimes there's social costs, namely on the environment, that we don't take into account. Okay, and the markets were not made to solve these problems, so that's why the government has to intervene and try to conduct the consumers, conduct the firms to behave properly. So this is the first point. So there's a good reason for policy interventions because markets are not delivering the outcome we want. And again, as I mentioned, I'm gonna focus on two types of policy interventions: the standard one and the behavioral one. So the standard economics paradigm is old, and there's again there's two actors: firms, consumers. Firms are assumed to maximize profits, which is an assumption that we are going to maintain even in the behavioral economics approach. The big difference is going to be what we assume about consumers. And in the standard economic approach, the consumers are, they maximize their utility, their pleasure, satisfaction, subject to some budget constraint, but they are kind of infinitely rational. They have no cognition costs. They can solve very complicated problems, and they have infinite willpower. They never, they always resist the temptation, and they have no behavioral. They're not optimistic. They're not overconfident. They don't have context effects, and all of these things are the standard Homo economicus. And I mean, you've seen this animal, right? And this is the animal that was taught in economics schools and business schools for a long time. Now, if you have this type of consumer, this very sophisticated and rational consumer, what can you do? Well, you still have market failures, but most of what you can do is, do the classical policy interventions that go through what some people call monetary incentives or prices. So you're going to change prices, right? If people are polluting too much, you're going to increase the cost of pollution. So people internalize these social costs. So how are you going to do that? Again, one example is a tax on carbon. CO2, right? So that's going to reduce technologies that are very intensive in emissions. Another very nice example from Switzerland is this tax on the trash bag that actually was very successful. Of course, we have to pay it, and this is the point of it, because if it wasn't expensive to buy the trash bag, people would not recycle. And there was a huge success in terms of increasing the rates of this recycling went up very much after this tax policy was implemented. So these instruments are very powerful, and they have, they are proved to have success. Of course, the dimension of CO2 taxes is way below, look at the US, look at China, other countries, is way below the levels it should be. But again, this is a problem that is kind of complicated. I'm not going to focus on that here today. But the levels of taxation have to be adapted, and there's a lot to do there still. Another mechanism that's very powerful, if you want to speed up technological shift, is also to give subsidies. And most forms of energy that existed in the past were always subsidized. Nuclear energy was subsidized. All forms of energies have been subsidized. And the same applies to the new technologies. So if you want to subsidize, switching to electric vehicles, you have to maybe give some subsidies to consumers to buy these type of cars. If you want to speed up adoption, maybe you have to create, the places where people can recharge the cars, subsidize that. You have to subsidize, solar power generation, wind power generation. All of this has also been done with different success in different countries in Europe and in the world. And again, we're doing steps in the right direction, but more can be done. And especially, again, stop the subsidies to the polluting industries. They still exist due to political, economic aspects of lobbying. Finally, the third typical intervention, I'm going to just call it mandates. This is kind of the most the most violent intervention when you ban things, right? And this is an example to this summer I was trying to set up a picnic for my daughter's birthday, and I thought I could get these plastic single-use dishes and cutlery, and it turns out it was forbidden. I wasn't aware of that, but I was very glad to substitute away. Actually, this is not a bad ban because you can easily substitute away to other forms, woods or paper, But I was happy and surprised that this was approved in July 2021. I think it's also applied here in Switzerland now. And in many other countries. So this is, again, good news, but this is kind of a violent intervention, but sometimes you need it because there was this awareness that we're not making enough progress in getting rid of plastic in the environment. So this is the standard economics view, but let's move to the behavioral economics, which is what I want to spend most of my time about. As I mentioned, firms are still maximizing profits. That's a good assumption. Sometimes we drop that assumption, but for here today, it doesn't matter. Let's stick to that assumption. And the consumers are going to be the key difference from the standard approach. So in behavioral economics, the consumers are boundedly rational, and that has a lot of meanings. They maximize something pleasure, but sometimes they don't know their preferences very well. Sometimes they are not fully aware of the choices that they have. Mostly they have limited attention, so there's going to be cognition costs, right? And I'm going to give several examples of these. They suffer context effects, so the context of choice, the architecture of choice, I'm also going to talk about that, is going to influence their choices in a way that it does not happen in standard economics with rational agents. And then these people, these consumers, they also have some form of inertia. They take a long time to cancel a contract, to start going to the gym, to move to healthy foods, to give up the burger, the pizza, to stop smoking. They have some inertia, and mostly they tend to procrastinate. So if there's something that has a small cost and a large reward, we tend to delay these activities. And so procrastination is a big problem in terms of the environment, because for doing something for the environment today, you need typically to have a small cost, which has a large benefit. And so typically people are going to postpone this switch to cleaner technologies because of procrastination. So the names here, they're all Nobel, except for Sunstein, but Simon, Kahneman, Taylor, they're all Nobel Prizes in economics. And Sunstein and Thaler, they developed this idea of the nudge, which is what we are going to call the policy interventions in terms of behavioral economics. So the policy interventions are not going to be about prices and monetary incentives. They're going to be about how you're going to change the way the consumer is going to choose. And this is called choice architecture. What is choice architecture? Is the social and physical background where the consumer is choosing between goods in a store or in some situation at home. And so the choice architecture is something that there's going to be kind of some choice architect that is going to try to change little things in the way the goods are presented, in what is the default and what is salient. And I'm going to give these 3 examples. And these are going to be called nudges. So a change in the choice architecture that's going to change behavior. And so the idea here is, again, that is a non-price intervention. And hopefully this is going to go in the direction of the true preferences of the consumer if it's done properly. Okay? So let me go into the details of examples of nudges. So I'm going to start with labeling and certification. And I mean, we've already seen the Nutri-Score, right? But this is an example of a nudge, if you think about it, right? So what's the problem here? So if you think about going to a store and buying some products, especially food, there's a lot of different varieties, right? Different brands. There's different prices. There's different quality. Maybe durability, right? How much it's going to last in the fridge. Then there's a carbon intensity, fair trade issues, and all of these things are part of a choice if you think about it. And it's too complicated, right? It's too many things, and you don't have enough computational power to compare all of these. okay? Except in very simple situations. Okay, so this is the problem. The consumer is confused oftentimes, and he doesn't have the power to think about this in a rational way. Again, even if you go and try to buy a very simple good that you could think it's easy to buy, it's not so easy, you know. And I challenge you to optimize in the choice of toilet paper. I've tried to do that once, and I can tell you it's not easy. This is the dark side of behavioral economics. Sometimes firms also shroud things, and they confuse consumers with a lot of choice. But I'm not going to talk about that today. Anyway, so the consumers, they need to be guided. They need clear and simple information in many choices, so they are able to make better and more rational decisions, and especially if you're worried about the environment, right? Again, we have some good examples of nudges, right? The energy efficient picture that you see when you buy a house, that you see when you are buying an electric appliance, a fridge for your home. This is very informative. And you know, if you buy a fridge, right, the buying price is not so important, but you know how much energy you're going to be used, because the fridge is going to be on your apartment for 10, 20 years or more, right? And so the energy cost is going to be critical in this choice, right? And people tend to forget about that when they buy a fridge. So it's very important. This information is critical if you're really doing a rational choice. For housing is the same thing, right? And then if you go in terms of food choices, the nutrition labels are a very simple way to give you an indication of the quality, the nutritional quality of food. And again, as we've seen, Nestle is moving fast in this direction, which I praise. It's a very good idea. We have this in Migros and Coop. They have nutrition labels for foods. So I think this is moving fast. Together with nutrition labels, we also need certifications. And certifications are critical because in many cases, right, the firms, they know they have better information about the carbon footprint of their goods, and this is private information. The consumers don't know it, and so and maybe some firms will have no incentive to disclose this information, and the certification from NGOs, for example, is a way to actually transmit this information to a consumer in a credible way. Okay, so we have to create markets for certification. Here is an example. Lidl has introduced recently these animal welfare labels in meat packages. So this is one dimension of buying meat, right? There's all the other dimensions, but now if you care about animal welfare, which maybe many of us do, you also look into this label. So this is, again, examples of nudges. Then there's defaults and active choice. So this is another famous example. So you have here a picture of organ donation. In countries where the default is for people to be donors, there's a lot more organs available for transplants than in countries where the default is for people to be non-donors. This is kind of surprising for standard economics. You would not expect these big differences just with the change of default, because it's kind of very, it's very inexpensive to just cross and opt out or opt in, one of these two decisions. But it's not the case. People tend to stick to the default. They see it as a recommendation, and they have, also inertia, and sometimes they don't want to think about the problem. Another example is saving for retirement, right? People should be rational because it's an important part of our lives. We have a lot of time in retirement. Most of us, we're going to live long. And a lot of people in the US, in the UK, in other countries where these studies have been done, if they are in a firm and if they are, if they're not enrolled automatically in a savings plan, they actually don't save as much. But if they start automatically enrolled, then they stick to that automatic enrollment option and they don't opt out. So there were these famous manipulations by Leibson and co-authors in firms, and the savings rates increased drastically in the UK and in the US, and also some experiments in Europe, just by changing the default. And again, another example from the banking sector, right? If you get your statements in paper, you're going to be hurting the environment substantially more than if you get electronic bank statements. So the default of electronic bank statements makes a big difference to save paper. So sometimes defaults have drawbacks because people are different, so the same default might not be ideal for everyone. An alternative is to give consumers an active choice, just give them the two possibilities and give them a deadline to make a choice. Okay, this kind of avoids some of the problems of defaults. The third aspect that I want to also raise here is salience. So as I mentioned, when we are shopping, we have limited attention and we have very limited time. And so we have to make a lot of, these are complicated decisions. We try to save on cognition costs. So it's going to be critical what we see in front of our eyes where are the products, where they're placed in the store. Are there adjacency properties? If you buy a pizza, if there's a salad next to it, maybe you take the salad. If there's no salad, you don't take it. Okay, so again, there's work by economists and psychologists that say that salience is really critical. And so you can also promote environmental goals, making salient certain features of products. And especially you want to give information that's kind of vivid and salient and not abstract and statistical. Maybe, should I go here, but this is not really in behavioral economics, and I've run out of time, but another aspect of consumer behavior that's changing, and it's very important to change consumer behavior, is social norms and social signaling. So many of our decisions in many domains depend on what our peers and our neighbors do, right? If I see all my colleagues driving electric cars, if I still have an old car with diesel or gasoline, I'm going to feel guilty. I'm going to feel bad, right? I think I'm the first in my street to have a hybrid vehicle. It's not fully electric, but my neighbors are very curious, and everybody's looking, what has he done? And so I'm trying to tell them, look, this works very well. It's a compromise between old technology and new technology that I've chosen, and especially does not consume a lot. So I'm trying to act as a leader here, an opinion leader. And there's a study in Sweden that shows that opinion leading and opinion seeking matters for purchase of electric vehicles. So these are aspects of consumer behavior. Sometimes also people want to signal to others that they're socially responsible. So this is, we value our image as socially responsible citizens. So I have a small quote here by Nobel Prize winners Duflo and Banerjee. They study some of these aspects of consumer behavior and also in terms of poverty and education. And they say that, preferences and habits, they're not set in stone. They actually can change quickly. And once they change, a lot of good things can happen. So I'm almost about to finish, but let me just give you this key takeaway diagram that kind of unites some of the topics today. So the key stakeholder in this problem is definitely consumers. Consumers are going to drive the change with two main tools, right? The way they purchase, also their portfolio investments, right? They can target firms that have pledged to net zero emissions. Of course, it's going to be an issue of certification that these firms are actually complying with these net zero emissions. So again, the certification is important. But again, also preferences are shifting, right? Via social norms and other effects, the preferences are shifting. And so the consumer is going to create pressure over firms, and firms have to innovate and respond to these different demands, more responsible from consumers. The government, when the consumer is kind of procrastinating or not doing enough, the governments and NGOs, they have to step in and they have to force the consumers to act, okay? Taxes, subsidies, but they also can act directly on firms with tax subsidies. And hopefully over time we have kind of a virtuous circle where there's going to be some kind of feedback loop. Firms might also be proactive, and managers of firms and CEOs of firms might also want to lead and influence consumers, the way they display their products, the choice architecture. The policy that I'm talking about, the choice architecture, the firms can use it to switch consumer behavior in the right direction. It's not just governments and NGOs. On the other hand, consumers can be more demanding on governments and NGOs, the way they also vote, and then they can kind of vote more for parties that have they're more worried about the environment, and they have better propositions how to shift. So is the glass half empty or half full? Well, depends on how you think about it. But again, if I went back 20 years ago, and if someone told me about these electric cars existing today, and what's happening in the car market, I would be surprised that things would happen so fast. So we should not lose hope that things can change, and we have to have the courage to change. Thank you.